Good morning. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm David Randall, Director of Research at the National Association of Scholars. I'd like to thank you all, to thank Dr. Jane Orient, to thank Dr. John Cash, who's particularly the reason I'm speaking here. And I am speaking on the irreproducibility crisis of modern science. I'm hoping you've all got a copy of this report I co-wrote with a good friend of mine, Chris Welzer. Oh, was that just a year ago? And this is generally part of the National Association of Scholars is very interested in reproducibility reforms, and I'm going to be giving an overview. What precisely is this all about? The irreproducibility crisis of modern science. And what is to be done? So, the irreproducibility crisis cost Brian Wansink his job. Over a 25-year career, Wansink developed an international reputation as an expert on eating behavior. He was the main popularizer of the notion that large portions lead inevitably to overeating. But Wansink resigned in 2018 as head of the Food and Brand Lab at Cornell University after an investigative faculty committee found he had committed a litany of academic breaches, misreporting of research data, problematic statistical techniques, failure to properly document and preserve research results, and much, much more. Wansink's fall from grace began with a 2016 blog post in which he blithely confessed to using improper research techniques known as p-hacking and harking. P-hacking involves running statistical analyses until they produce a statistically significant result. Harking stands for hypothesizing after the results are known. Wansink's blog post prompted a small group of skeptics to take a hard look at his past scholarship. Their analysis, published in January 2017, turned up an astonishing variety and quantity of errors in his statistical procedures and data. But what had Wansink done wrong? In essence, his critics accused him of abusing statistical procedures to create the illusion of successful research, and thereby hangs a cautionary tale, not just about Brian Wansink, but about the entire vast irreproducibility crisis of modern science. And I'll say, we say irreproducibility crisis, because frankly that's what it is. You'll also hear reproducibility crisis, replication crisis. They all refer to the same thing, but we say it with the most syllables and most accurately. The irreproducibility crisis afflicts a wide range of scientific and social scientific disciplines. Improper research techniques, lack of accountability, disciplinary and political groupthink, and a scientific culture biased toward producing positive results together have produced a critical state of affairs. Many supposedly scientific results cannot be reproduced reliably in subsequent investigations. They offer no trustworthy insight into the way the world works. In 2005, Dr. John Ioannidis, my poster boy, and he's famous and rightly so, crystallized scientific awareness of the modern irreproducibility crisis. He argued, shockingly and persuasively, that most published research findings in his own field of medicine were false. Major problems affecting the field included, and there's 9 of them: 1, abuse of statistical significance; 2, systematic incorporation of bias into research through selective or distorted reporting; 3, excessive reliance on small sample sizes; 4, excessive reliance on small numbers of studies; 5, excessive confidence in studies reporting small effects; 6, excessive reliance on fishing expeditions to find new relationships between variables. 7, excessively flexible research designs. 8, distortion of research because of ideology or financial interest. And 9, distortion of research because disciplinary fashion placed a premium on quickly produced positive results. Ioannidis concluded that when you accounted for all these factors, a majority of new research findings in medicine and in many other scientific fields were probably wrong. Oh, and I should have had, my 9 causes. This is a great cartoon, XKCD, somewhat vulgar, but a good science cartoon. He's really good on various cartoons, the cartoonist on the reproducibility crisis. This sort of stuff, we get it all the time. So, many common forms of improper scientific practice contribute to the irreproducibility crisis. Some researchers compare variables until they find a spurious, statistically significant relationship. Many have a poor understanding of statistical methodology and routinely employ statistics improperly in their research. Researchers may consciously or unconsciously bias their data to produce desired outcomes, or combine data sets in such a way as to invalidate their conclusions. Researchers able to choose between multiple measures of a variable often decide to use the one which provides a statistically significant result. Apparently legitimate procedures all too easily drift across a fuzzy line into illegitimate manipulations of research techniques. What are the irreproducibility crisis's components? The irreproducibility crisis partly stems from the technical characteristics of modern science. Scientists increasingly conduct research that uses statistical methodology to discern low-power effects. Modern scientists now investigate difficult problems that are intrinsically liable to error. Yet much of the irreproducibility crisis also stems from the existing culture and institutions of modern scientific endeavor. Uncontrolled researcher freedom makes it easy for researchers to err. Lack of constraints on their research designs allows scientists to alter their methods midway through a study as they pursue publishable, statistically significant results. Researchers often justify midstream alteration of research procedures as flexibility. But in practice, such flexibility frequently justifies researchers' unwillingness to accept a negative outcome. This wonderful 2011 article estimated that providing 4 degrees of researcher freedom, 4 ways to shift the design of the experiment while it is in progress, can lead to a 61% false positive rate. 61%. I would add, they also then did it themselves. They proved that listening to certain music makes you 18 months younger. And they showed how they, did it by, 4 degrees of researcher freedom. It was really eye-opening. It was a great article. The absence of openness in much scientific research poses a related problem. Researchers far too rarely share data and methodology once they complete their studies. Scientists ought to be able to check and critique one another's work, but a great deal of research can't be evaluated properly Because researchers don't always make their data and study protocols available to the public. Sometimes unreleased datasets simply vanish because computer files are lost or corrupted, or because no provision is made to transfer data to up-to-date systems. In these cases, other researchers lose the ability to examine the data and verify that it has been handled correctly. Modern scientists' search for statistically significant results stems in good measure from the scientific discipline's adoption of p is less than 0.05 and other p-values, but that's the most common one in a great many disciplines, as the convenient standards for statistical significance. P less than 0.05 became the standard for professional publication and for all corollary benefits to scientists' careers and reputations. Scientists have an incentive to publish statistically significant results. In consequence, scientific publications suffer from positive bias towards statistically significant results. And again, this wonderful XKCD guy, it's funny because it's true. This is how a great many scientists think, as they indeed acknowledge in their more honest moments. And I should say that, I don't want to be too cynical. Many, many scientists will acknowledge this. So, modern science's professional culture prizes positive results far above negative results, and also far above attempts to reproduce earlier research. Scientists steer away from replication studies, and their negative results go into the file drawer. Recent studies provide evidence that this phenomenon afflicts fields such as climate science, psychology, sociology, and even dentistry, which I love the fact that you now need reproducible dental science. It makes me feel better whenever I go to the dentist. So, the positive bias in modern research is exacerbated by the incentives of quantitative performance metrics of publication and citation as a measure of scientific productivity, journal publication, and tenure. Government grants, whose funding boards place greater value on positive results than on negative results and replication studies, also worsen positive bias. Groupthink, and here we have, of course, the most dramatic example in modern memory of groupthink. We all know the Challenger story, groupthink. Don't need to go into that? All right. So, well, you all said yes loudly. Groupthink also inhibits attempts to check results, since replication studies can undermine comfortable beliefs. An entire academic discipline can succumb to groupthink and create a professional consensus with a strong tendency to dismiss results that question its foundations. The overwhelming political homogeneity of academics has also created a culture of groupthink that distorts academic research. Researchers readily accept results that confirm a liberal worldview while rejecting conservative conclusions out of hand. Political groupthink particularly affects fields with obvious policy implications, such as social psychology and climate science. Which is to say, I could have given that exact same paragraph at whatever professional organization. I could have substituted, there's been people were thinking that cholesterol has everything to do with heart attacks, and it's really sugar. There was disciplinary groupthink, and everybody would nod their heads. And then I'd say, and it could affect climate science and social psychology. And people go, what do you mean? So there's a willingness to accept some of this, but not all of this. How big an effect does the irreproducibility crisis have on scientific research? John Ioannidis alarming conclusions spurred the scientific community to see just how bad the irreproducibility crisis was. Subsequent evidence confirmed that the crisis of irreproducibility had compromised entire disciplines. In 2012, the biotechnology firm Amgen tried to reproduce 53 landmark studies in hematology and oncology, but could only replicate 6. In that same year, the director of the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research at the Food and Drug Administration estimated that up to 3/4 of published biomarker associations could not be replicated. A 2015 article in Science presented the results of 100 replication studies of articles published in prominent psychological journals that found that only 36% of the replication studies produced statistically significant results, compared with 97% of the original studies. And this bit here, replication effects have half the mean effect sizes of the original effects. I may say this later in my wonderfully typed up speech. It's worth mentioning effect size is part of the claim. Even if something reproduces with half the effect size, that's not what the original claim was. The claim was not just that there's an effect, but that it has a particular size. So even just to say such and such an effect is much less dramatic, that really matters in and of itself. And shall we say, if the evidence is between 1 degree of climate warming and 2 degrees, or between 1 degree and 3 degrees, that, for example, would really make a difference. That sort of stuff. So, whether this body of irreproducible research amounts to a crisis, somebody else used this slide, by the way, earlier. I so object. It's like coming to a party with wearing the same clothes as somebody else. Whether this amounts to a crisis depends on how you define a crisis. Reproducibility researcher Daniele Finelli argues that no irreproducibility crisis exists. But his counter-argument presumes that a crisis involves an increasing amount of irreproducible research and a state of affairs where a majority of new research is irreproducible. And he makes what I think is a straw man argument. The argument that an irreproducibility crisis exists is that there is a long-standing state of affairs where at least a large minority of research is unreproduced and much unreproduced research irreproducible. This claim acknowledges that the incidence of unreproduced research varies by discipline and subdiscipline, with the fields heavily dependent on underpowered statistical procedures the worst hit. Unproduced does not mean disproven. Scientists expect some research to fail to reproduce at least once. Some replication studies may be less rigorous than the original studies they replicate. And the failure to replicate may say more about the weakness of the replication study than the weakness of the original study. Neither does irreproducible only mean that a reported effect fails entirely to reproduce. And that's what I was just saying back here. If you have a substantial reduction in the power of the reported effect, that is effectively irreproduced. So this is the proper definition of irreproducibility, because scientific claims to truth, not just about the existence of effect, about the size. So, to claim the existence of an irreproducibility crisis does not require you to endorse fully John Ioannidis' original, wonderful headline claim that a majority of new published research is probably false. This may have been an overestimate. It happens. Some researchers estimate substantially lower rates of irreproducibility than the studies I mentioned above, although I'll say some also say higher. Scholars have subjected to searching criticism the meta-analyses and replication studies that substantiate the argument that an irreproducibility crisis exists. And meta-analysts must decide, perhaps arbitrarily, which studies to analyze. A replication study may fail to replicate procedures properly. So, scientists should not accept on faith the highest estimates for the scope of the irreproducibility crisis. Nevertheless, the large number of replication studies revealing mass failures to reproduce properly do indicate quite substantial problems with modern science's procedures. And the current reproducibility literature suggests, and this is my entirely unscientific estimate, a typical subdiscipline that relies on statistical analysis has a persisting irreproducibility rate of about 25%. And that state of affairs, I submit, is a crisis, which I define, and I think we all should define, as a sufficiently shocking status quo which justifies the extraordinary effort, cost, and drudgery needed to change ordinary scientific procedures and professional culture. By the way, I do want to emphasize drudgery. I will get into more of this, but what you need to do to make this stuff reproducible, a lot of it's really tedious. You can understand why a scientist would just say, why should I bother? Because you have to, and it's a crisis. But I mean, I don't want to underemphasize that it's wearisome. Now, slight shift in emphasis. How does the irreproducibility crisis affect what the government does? And that's going to be one of the headline bits here. The federal government subsidizes research in a broad range of sciences and social sciences. It also depends on research in the sciences and social sciences to justify a vast amount of regulation. The irreproducibility crisis wastes taxpayer dollars which fund irreproducible research. Large numbers of costly, needless regulations are based on junk science. Virtually every scientific discipline and governmental agency is affected by the irreproducibility crisis. Making science reproducible will improve every one of these disciplines and agencies. And now I have a list. So, health sciences, and that's what this is going to be referred to. According to a 2015 study, the government funds 2/3 of preclinical research in America, and half of that research is irreproducible. Of the $28 billion our country wastes each year in irreproducible preclinical research, the government share is $19 billion. Several recent studies show that nearly 90% of cancer biology publications are irreproducible. Both National Institutes of Health research funding and the Food and Drug Administration's drug approval process both require improved scientific reproducibility. Energy and agriculture. Irreproducibility crisis affects fields such as hydrogen storage materials, energy system modeling, oil production modeling, agronomy, and nutrition research. Economics. A 2015 study could not reproduce a majority of a sample of 67 reputable economics articles. A 2016 study replicated 61% of 18 original research studies, but with an average effect size reduced by 1/3. Right now, regulatory activists are trying to get the Federal Trade Commission to regulate common ownership of competing companies, basic stock investment. That's based upon research that can't be reproduced. Federal economic policy also must be based on reproducible research. Education. The entire concept of microaggression is based on irreproducible social psychology research. So is that of implicit bias. Yet the National Science Foundation funds projects such as, and I think this is my slide here, yes, exploring racial microaggression in science education. And the Department of Education relies on the concept of implicit bias in reports on improving school climate and discipline. These grants and reports, based on irreproducible research, drive education policy. It's really quite depressing. I should say, I'm focusing on government, but even worse, of course, is all the freelance education policy done in every college and university where they say, oh, everybody knows implicit bias is real, therefore we need to, impose something new and horrible. In effect, you need to get reproducibility out there, not just to reform the government, but to shame all the freelance people trying to impose implicit bias and microaggressions on the rest of us. So, that wasn't written down, that was all impromptu. Government contracts. Government contracts, such as those awarded by the Department of Transportation, are awarded with racial preferences on the basis of disparity studies. But these disparity studies are themselves founded on flawed research that can't be reproduced. Government procurement should not use flawed research that cannot be reproduced to justify departing from the principle of equal opportunity for all Americans. And then climate science, which I frankly have not done so much on because you've got a lot more on climate science at this conference. But there have been several studies that have found significant publication bias toward positive results in climate science journals, particularly in flagship journals such as Science and Nature. 2 scientists concluded in 2007 that the entire field of probabilistic climate projection, which is, say that 3 times fast, which relies on combining multiple climate models, had no verifiable relation to the actual climate and thus no predictive value. I should say, by the way, and these are people who are in the mainstream of climate science, who in effect are saying we believe the results basically, but we need to do our procedures better. If you aren't in the mainstream, you might look at this and say, no value? In 2010, a researcher tested a randomly selected issue of Journal of Climate and found that about 3/4 of the articles misused significance tests. A 2016 article on how to improve computational results in weather and climate science stated that it is impossible to replicate and verify most of the computational results presented in journal articles today. I'm going to confess, I look for wonderful phrases like that, but my golly, you don't actually have to look that hard to find them. There's a lot of stuff like this. So, entire climate change crisis, and I'll just use this very carefully, may well be a pyramid of irreproducible research. It would be a good idea to go back and have that discipline redone according to the proper standards. What should be done to change how science operates? A series of procedural and cultural reforms would alleviate large portions of the irreproducibility crisis. All data concerning research materials and procedures should be made publicly accessible to every scientist. And this ambition, I submit, is technologically and economically feasible. We now possess cheap file storage technologies and an extensive network of high-capacity internet connections. Public accessibility also requires standardized access and storage software, as well as continuing investment to fund updates of hardware, software, and data files so that they remain compatible with contemporary information system technology. The expense to fund both standardized software and continuing upgrades will be substantial, but certainly affordable in a world that spends more than $1.8 trillion annually in research and development. I must say, when I found that number, I was startled. That's a really big number, even by modern inflated standards. The catalog of publicly accessible materials and data should include pre-registered research protocols, publicly accessible and ideally born open data files, and standardized descriptions of materials and research procedures. Given the current and legal and ethical requirements for anonymizing human subject data before allowing it to be disclosed publicly, policymakers and scientists also should expedite anonymizing existing research data on human subjects, replicate key research on human subjects while using the highest standards of anonymity, and make fully anonymized data the standard professional expectation in future research on human subjects. And by the way, and anonymization is difficult. And in effect, one of the things is, how can we do it successfully given that, people like Google are doing their best to find out everything they can about you with a minimum amount of data? It's a real query about how to anonymize properly. I don't say it's easy, I do think it's doable. And then, what is this referring to? Current political disputes concerning, for example, the status of the Harvard Six Cities study as a basis for air pollution regulation underline the political utility of anonymizing existing and future research to create a broad public consensus that any such regulation actually is necessary. Scientists should also make structural changes to their professional culture. Researchers should standardly expect that they will provide to their peers and be provided by them substantially greater proportions of their research materials. Default professional standards should include the expectation that researchers will use pre-registered research protocols, use standardized descriptions of research procedures and materials, and provide all data, including negative and duplicative results. Disciplines that rely on statistical analysis should tighten or eliminate the standard of statistical significance. By the way, there's an internal civil war between tighten, eliminate, tighten, eliminate. I'm splitting the difference here and saying one or the other. It's highly technical, and it might be you want different solutions for different disciplines. I'll just mention. Measures of scientific impact also should explicitly quantify the greater value of a reproduced result. R equals 1, R equals 2, R equals 3, where R is the number of times this has been reproduced, and if R equals 0, pay no mind. Scientists will have a harder task as they tackle academic groupthink. Perhaps each discipline should institutionalize extradisciplinary critique and establish committees staffed by professionals in other disciplines who routinely evaluate the intellectual openness of individual departments and the discipline as a whole. College and university administrations should guarantee that dissenters from disciplinary orthodoxy can continue their careers. Scientists must change the incentives provided by the infrastructure of modern science, tenure, government grants, professional journals, to make reproducibility required rather than optional. And I do love these little Groupthink cartoons too. It really is something. I mean, I feel it myself whenever I'm in a small room and everybody else says something and I sort of feel the urge to go along. I mean, it's not like we're all subject to this. It's something we all have to resist. So, and ambitious researchers should no longer be forced into the position of Brian Wansink, who recycled his data because he could not expect to publish a negative result. What should be done to change education in statistics and science? And this is big. Education reform is key to solving the irreproducibility crisis. Science educators should integrate courses that impart a basic understanding of statistics into the nation's high school and college curricula. Such courses would not require advanced mathematics, since students can understand the principles of statistical analysis without knowing how to derive the equation for a particular probability distribution. The courses should focus instead on the proper use and potential pitfalls of statistically based research. In science courses generally, science educators should work to make students aware of both the characteristic vulnerabilities of modern science and the limits to the certainty that statistics can provide. Government education policy should support these changes. State governments should reform high school curricula to include courses in statistics literacy and use their funding and oversight powers over public universities to encourage university administrations to add a statistical literacy course to their general education requirements. The federal government should also employ its funding and regulatory powers to encourage statistical literacy in primary, secondary, and post-secondary education. Scientists should consider creating an independent discipline of experimental design, institutionalized in university departments and with its own professional association. This discipline, building upon and providing deeper theoretical grounding for existing instruction in experimental design and research methods, and basically every scientific discipline you're as like as not going to get an experimental design course at some point. These don't seem, however, to have been doing enough. These new courses in this new department should include the history of scientific epistemology, applied ontology, philosophy of classifications, emphasizing the theoretical underpinnings of standardized descriptions, the theory of complex systems, which by their nature cannot easily be modeled. The theoretical underpinnings of statistics, I'll just leave that there for a while. The theoretical underpinnings of statistics, emphasizing its limited capacity to reduce uncertainty, the theoretical rationale for data sharing and replication experiments, integrated with a survey of their institutional architecture. And we should also have, this discipline should also have research methods courses and practica in experimental design and observational studies. Graduate students in all sciences and social sciences should be required to take a sequence of survey courses and practica in this discipline. and introductory courses should be required for all undergraduate science and social science majors. And the public also needs to be educated properly by science journalists who must change the way they report. Too many science journalists simply reproduce press releases, which encourages researchers to pursue conclusions that produce an eye-grabbing headline. Science journalists rarely give as much attention to retractions or corrections of published research as they do to extreme and exciting new claims. In 2004, the media extensively publicized a claim by the Centers for Disease Control, that chart there, that 400,000 Americans died from obesity each year. And somehow the media paid far less attention to the CDC's later retraction when it discovered errors in its statistical methodology. Even fewer news outlets publicized the CDC researchers' new estimate that, in 2005, that the number of annual deaths from obesity was only 112,000. They'd gotten it wrong. 100,000 versus 400,000. Oops. And in fact, and people going hysterical and mad across the country and worrying about dying of obesity. And a proper diet never hurts, exercise isn't bad, but you shouldn't be doing things based on false hysteria. And this sort of stuff happens all the time. And there's just I'm sure you've all seen hundreds, thousands of such, scare everybody and make them hide under the bed stories. It's the staple of modern science journalism. Private foundations should support the reform of science journalism by funding continuing education of journalists into the scientific issues underlying the reproducibility crisis. The Medical Evidence Boot Camp, organized by the Knight Science Journalism Program at MIT, provides a pretty good model for how foundations can help improve journalists' coverage of science. What should be done to change how government funds science? And that really is the kicker. The federal government spends $140 billion annually on science research and development. It is the largest single funder of scientific research in the world. An extraordinarily large amount of scientific research is either funded by the federal government or conducted in the hopes of eventually getting a federal grant. And realistically, your entire career as a scientist, you have to conduct thinking, at some point I'm going to apply for a little bit of federal money, and I need to do everything to build myself up such that I'm credible when I can get that grant, which is going to be essential for making, getting me tenure, getting me fame, everything. It's the key, the hinge. Federal grant rules set the expectations for scientific research as a whole. They should be reformed to change scientists' incentives so that they produce reliably reproducible research. Some parts of the government have already started reproducibility reforms. The National Institutes for Health supports archiving and sharing of methods and data via its support of the Immunology Database and Analysis Portal, and it encourages pre-registration of clinical trials via its support of the clinicaltrials.gov website. It also recently redoubled its explicit emphasis on rigor and reproducibility in its granting process and its overall strategic plan. And the National Academy of Medicine now supports sharing data from clinical trials. Still, the government's response is only in its first stages. Other parts of the government, such as the Environmental Protection Agency, should adopt the NIH's existing standards. But all federal science grants need to go much farther in requiring irreproducible research. As officials make reforms, they need to recognize that the trouble isn't just that loose rules allow funding of irreproducible research. This is part of a larger problem. The search for government funds itself encourages scientists to produce irreproducible research. This is part of a larger problem of funding bias. Government funding tends to fund safe research, research by older scientists, and research at a small number of prestigious institutions. But funding bias also directly produces irreproducible research. Scientists produce exciting positive results because that's what grant funders like. And a great many of these positive results are spurious. Government reforms need to change how grant panelists choose grants, as well as how scientists do research. Each agency should create a new grant category dedicated to replication studies. Each agency should require grant recipients to pre-register their research protocols and make publicly available all their data, algorithms, statistical programs, and procedures. In fields where good laboratory practice standards apply, government should only fund research that follows good laboratory practice standards. Government should also dedicate grant funds toward improving university hardware and software. Many hard-working, unrecognized IT guys make scientific research possible, and they can use our support to make scientific research reproducible. These reforms should improve both what researchers and grant panelists do. Groupthink also affects the government granting process. The legitimate desire to have experts use peer review to judge the quality of a grant too often allows a group-thinking clique to capture an agency. Grant panels also need to be reformed to prevent the panelists' bias toward groupthink. Government should consider solutions such as limiting the ability of grant recipients to serve as grant panelists, requiring that panels include members recruited from a variety of institutions, including private industry, and instituting maximums of grant money available for any researcher or institution. Above all, the grant-making process itself needs to be as transparent as possible so that the public can detect when it is affected by positive bias and groupthink. What should be done to change how science informs government policy? And this is, again, another one of those kickers. An extraordinary amount of federal policy is informed by scientific and social scientific research. A great many individual laws and regulations require that the government use best available science, but the definition of best available science is out of date. Peer-reviewed science is accepted, but reproducible science isn't required, much less reproduced science. A large number of our regulations are based on junk science, and we won't know which until we adopt strict reproducibility standards for assessing the science that informs our regulations. Federal, state, and local agencies should adopt strict reproducibility standards for the science that informs the drafting of new regulations. In all areas, they should adopt the following two principles. Government policy should rely exclusively on research that has been pre-registered, reproduced, and subject to meta-analysis for bias. analysis for bias, and government policy should ensure that the exercise of scientific expertise can itself be independently reproduced and verified. At the federal level, we need a transparent science executive order or law. The government should define best available science to include only publicly accessible research in all grant awards, professional assessments, administrative processes, and professional interactions with other government agencies. And by the way, that's condensing. For the full bureaucratic version, there's like 20 different precise names for what the government does, and you've got to have this apply to every single one of them. It should also require government science agencies to add only publicly accessible research to repositories such as the EPA's Science Inventory, influential scientific information, highly influential scientific assessments, and peer review agendas. The government should also require all new significant regulatory actions and highly influential scientific assessments. And those, by the way, they're both terms of art. Significant regulatory action, highly influential scientific assessment. It has a precise bureaucratic meaning as you make policy. All such things should include substantially reproduced research. Substantially reproduced research should be defined as research whose main conclusions have been substantiated in at least 2 independent studies that themselves qualify as best available science. Significant regulatory actions and highly influential scientific assessments should also include a professional literature assessment, including both a meta-analysis and a publication bias study. All new significant regulatory actions and highly influential scientific assessments that bear on regulatory fields where good laboratory practice standards apply should include only research that meets good laboratory practice standards. And I just want to, I've not been going after each of these images. I got this off of a guy, one of these reproducibility reformers himself, and he puts it himself. I do think this is actually like worth taking a little bit of time. I do think this is like my favorite image ever done. Status quo research, I'll go over here, not pre-registered, data and materials not archived, status quo, that's what everything happens. Barely worth a mention, should not inform policy, should be heavily caveated in the media if reported at all. That's virtually all science we've got now. And then exploratory open science, not pre-registered, data and materials archived, shouldn't directly inform policy, can be reported in the media, prominent caveats. Confirmatory open science, pre-registered, data and materials archived, relevant, beware of publication bias. You can mention it to the journalists. Registered report, pre-registered, data and materials archive, immune to publication bias. Yes, now you can start to pay attention. Highly relevant, worthy of significant media attention. But even so, meta-analysis of registered reports, pre-registered data and materials archive, that's what you really want to care about. And, would it be too cruel to say 1% of science meets that level? Probably that's a little cruel, but it's at this point still probably a pretty small minority, and I really think this image is. If you're going to take one thing away from this hour, take that pyramid away. So, all right. Federal government should also create review commissions for each regulatory agency to investigate whether existing regulations are based on well-grounded, reproducible research. These should establish the scope of the problem by identifying those regulations that rely on unreplicated or irreproducible research and recommend which regulations should be revoked. This is like totally modest. This will be very easy to happen, So, but shoot for the moon. Regulatory administrators or Congress should put these recommendations into practice by revoking all regulations that lack a proper scientific basis. And you know, this is an aspiration. You all know, I think, how difficult that would be, but you know, we do not know, but some large numbers of those regulations aren't doing anything of any use. It would be a good idea to find out what they are. It would be a good idea, once we found out which they are, to get rid of them, or at the very least, make the scientists do the science again, give them a 5-year grace period, and actually try to do it to proper standards. And if they can't do it by then, goodbye regulation. Okay, details. Policymakers should prioritize the review of these regulatory agencies with the greatest effect on the American economy and Americans' individual lives. The earliest possible reproducibility assessment should be taken of regulations concerning climate change, air pollution, pharmaceuticals approval, biological effects of nuclear radiation, the identification and assessment of learning disabilities, and dietary guidelines. If you have other suggestions for the top ones, the dirty dozen, come to me, talk to me. Those struck me as not bad places to start. Government regulation should be based on the best available science. The best available science means reproducible science and substantially reproduced science. Optimism. Conclusion, where are we going from here? The battle against the scourge of irreproducibility in science is not new. Science has always imposed constraints on human nature in the pursuit of truth. Empiricism, the obligation to gather data, forces scientists to submit their preconceptions to experimental proof. Rigorous precision, including the use of statistical methods, serves to check laziness and carelessness. Science's struggle for empiricism and precision has always been fought against the all too human incentives to pursue predetermined conclusions and professional advancement. So the shortcomings of modern statistics-based research should not surprise us. Yet they have done great harm, and they undermine faith in the power and promise of science. We need new incentives, new institutional mechanisms, and a new awareness of how science can go wrong. The pursuit of scientific truth requires the public to scrutinize and critique the activity of scientific professionals and to join with them to reform the practice of modern science. And there we go.